Grease permanently stained the cuffs of Nidia's apron, carrying the heavy scent of burnt rye and sour cider. She was tallying sticky copper coins when a man darkened her doorway, dripping freezing mud onto her warped floorboards. He wore a ruined cashmere coat smelling of crushed lavender and sheer hollow desperation. Lowering his bruised face, he quietly begged for her dankest cellar cot. Instead, driven by a dormant, spiteful pity, she handed this broken aristocrat the key to her finest room, Grease. It coated everything. No matter how hard Nidia scrubbed the scarred oak of the tavern tables, a thin, slick film always remained, trapping the smells of burnt mutton and spilled ale. She leaned her weight into the coarse, bristled brush, her shoulders protesting with a dull, familiar ache. It was past midnight. The hearth fire had burned down to a sullen orange eye, casting long, wavering shadows against the plaster walls of Stuart's Rest. The wind outside howled a low, sustained whistle that rattled the warped window panes. Nidia paused, dragging the back of her forearm across her forehead. Her skin was gritty with hearth ash and dried sweat. She was tallying the day's meager copper in her head, barely enough to cover the grain delivery on Tuesday, certainly not enough to pay off the magistrate's latest arbitrary fee, when the front door's hinges shrieked. A gust of damp night air invaded the room, bringing with it the sharp scent of decaying leaves and wet earth. Nidia didn't look up immediately. She methodically wrung her rag out over a wooden bucket, the dirty water splashing softly. "Kitchen's closed," she said, her voice flat, raspy from inhaling smoke all evening. "Beds are 4 coppers. 2 if you don't mind sharing with a snoring wool merchant. I require a room." The voice was low, raw at the edges, like vocal cords rubbed raw by silence or shouting. "The cheapest you have. A cellar cot will do." A corner in the stables. Nidia finally looked up. He stood just inside the threshold, water pooling around his boots. They were calfskin, she noted instantly. Ruined, caked in yellow mud, but custom-stitched. The coat he wore was dark navy wool, heavy and sodden, clinging to a broad frame that seemed to be actively folding in on itself. He was shivering, though he tried to mask it by clenching his jaw. His hair was plastered to his forehead, dark and dripping. He didn't look like a vagrant. He looked like money that had been thrown out a window. "I don't rent the stables to people. The horses get nervous," Nidia said, wiping her hands on her stained apron. She walked behind the wooden counter, her eyes narrowing as she assessed him. "And the cellar is flooded. You have coin, or are you just tracking mud onto my floors for the sport of it?" The man reached into his coat with trembling fingers. He didn't argue. He didn't puff up his chest and demand respect, which was what wealthy men usually did when she spoke to them with anything less than a curtsy. He simply withdrew a leather coin purse and placed a single silver piece on the scarred wood. It chimed heavily. Nidia stared at the silver. It was a royal mint stamped with the king's profile. It could buy her in for a month. "I don't have change for that," she said, her tone hardening. Wealthy men with silver pieces who wanted to sleep in cellars brought trouble. They brought men with swords looking for them. They brought pregnant daughters or stolen horses or political treason. Nidia didn't have the energy for treason. She had bread to bake at dawn. "I don't want change," he said. His eyes finally met hers. They were bloodshot, surrounded by bruised purple skin. There was a hollow emptiness in his gaze that made Nadia's stomach twist, an uncomfortable, sudden lurch of pity that she instantly resented. "Just a door that locks." She looked from the coin to his ruined face. Practicality warred with a stupid, dormant instinct to care. If she put him in the damp storeroom, he'd likely catch a fever and die. Corpse would mean dealing with the local guard. A corpse meant paperwork. A corpse meant shutting down the tap room. She snatched the silver piece off the counter. It felt cold and heavy in her palm. Nidia reached up to the iron board behind her and pulled down a heavy brass key. It belonged to room 4. The room at the end of the hall, the one with the thickest walls, the down mattress, and the window that faced the woods instead of the road. "Top of the stairs, lost door on the left," she muttered, tossing the key onto the counter. It clattered sharply. He looked at the key, then up at her. I asked for the cheapest room, and I gave you the only one available. Nidia lied, her face entirely blank. Don't bleed on the linens. If you puke, aim for the chamber pot, or I'm keeping your boots. He stared at her for a long second, a flicker of something, confusion perhaps, or merely the slow processing of a mind deadened by exhaustion, crossed his features. He didn't thank her. He simply took the key, his fingers brushing the wood, and turned toward the stairs. Nidia watched him go. His gait was uneven, heavy. She listened to his boots thump against the wooden treads, a slow rhythmic drum beat, until a door opened and clicked shut on the floor above. She looked at the silver piece in her hand. She slipped it into the deep pocket of her skirt, picked up her scrub brush, and went back to the grease. Dawn at Stuart's Rest did not break. It seeped. Grey light filtered through the cracked glass of the kitchen windows, illuminating dust motes dancing over the massive stone hearth. Nidia had been awake for 2 hours. Her knuckles were stiff and swollen, a sharp reminder of the damp chill that had settled into her bones over the last 5 years. She was violently kneading dough on the floured wooden block, punishing the mixture of rye and cheap wheat. The inn was quiet. The wool merchant had left before sunrise, grumbling about the price of oats. That left only the man in room 4. She expected him to be gone. Men running from their lives usually left before the sun could expose them. The stairs groaned. Nidia didn't stop kneading. She heard the soft scuff of boots, not the heavy clump of a farmer, but the measured, deliberate step of someone who had been taught how to walk in drawing rooms. He appeared in the kitchen archway. In the unforgiving morning light, he looked worse. His clothes had dried stiff and wrinkled, smelling faintly of the lavender she used to stuff the mattresses. He had attempted to smooth his hair, but it was thick and uncooperative. The bruising around his eyes was starker, a yellowish purple against his pale skin. He stood there awkwardly. He didn't know what to do with his hands. Sit, Nidia ordered, pointing a flour-caked finger at a small stool near the hearth. Unless you prefer hovering. He blinked, then moved to the stool, sitting down slowly, as if his joints were made of rusted iron. He watched her work. It was an intense, silent scrutiny that made the back of Nidia's neck prickle. There's porridge in the iron pot, she said, nodding toward the fire. Bowls are on the shelf. You have hands, use them. In his world, Nidia guessed food appeared on silver trays carried by people who kept their eyes on the floor. Here he stared at the blackened iron pot as if it were an unexploded bomb. He stood, retrieved a chipped wooden bowl, and ladled a thick grey lump of oats into it. It smelled of scorched milk and salt. He sat back down and took a bite. His expression didn't change, though Nidia knew the porridge was barely edible. She had burned the bottom of the pot. "How long does the silver piece buy me?" he asked suddenly. His voice was clearer this morning, a deep, resonant baritone that filled the small kitchen. Nidia punched the dough, folding it over itself. "It bought you last night. And maybe this bowl of sludge you're forcing down." He stopped eating. "A silver royal is worth 3 months' board at a decent establishment." "This isn't a decent establishment," Nidia counted, turning to face him, wiping flour onto her apron. "And I didn't ask for a silver royal. I told you I didn't have change. You told me to keep it. In my inn, that's called a donation. It was a test. A blatant, cynical push to see if he would snap. If he demanded his money back, if he yelled, she would kick him out. She needed him to be a snob so she could justify throwing him to the wolves. Instead, he looked down at his ball. "I see." Nidia frowned. That was it. "Look," she sighed, the fight draining out of her. "I don't run a charity, and I don't run a sanctuary for lords playing peasant. The silver buys you a week. After that, you need copper or you need to leave. I don't take jewelry, and I don't take signet rings. They're impossible to fence in this town without getting hanged." He looked up, a ghost of a wry smile pulling at the corner of his chapped lips. It was a small, broken thing, but it completely changed his face. "I assure you I have no signet rings left to give." "Then you have a problem," Nidia said, turning her back to him to slide the dough into a cast iron pan. "I can work." Nidia paused. She looked over her shoulder. He was dead serious. The Duke, or Earl, or whatever he was offering to scrub floors. She let out a short, harsh laugh. You work? I doubt you know which end of a broom to hold. I am capable of learning. Learning takes time. I need wood chopped now. 2 cords of it out back before the frost sets in. She challenged. Can you swing an axe? Yes, he lied. She could hear it in the slight hesitation, the way his jaw tightened. Fine, Nydia said, gesturing toward the back door. The axe is by the stump. Don't sever a toe. I don't have bandages. He stood up, leaving half his porridge. He walked past her, smelling of stale sweat and expensive linen. Nydia watched the back door swing shut, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. She had a fugitive lord in her best room, and she had just handed him a sharp weapon. 4 days passed. He didn't leave. His name, he finally offered on the 2nd day, was Ephraim. Just Ephraim. Nydia didn't press. She preferred the lie. Knowing a surname meant knowing a house, and knowing a house meant knowing exactly who was going to eventually come looking for him. Ephraim was atrocious at chopping wood. Nydia stood by the kitchen window wiping a pewter mug with a rag, watching him in the yard. The midday sun was pale and weak, casting long shadows across the frost-bitten grass. Ephraim was swinging the heavy iron axe like it was a broadsword. He was using entirely too much arm and not enough core. The blade kept biting into the side of the log, glancing off or getting stuck in the grain. He was sweating profusely, his expensive wool abandoned on a nearby barrel. His linen shirt was stained and clinging to his back. Nydia let out a breath of irritation. She tossed the mug onto the counter and marched out the back door. The cold air bit at her exposed cheeks. You're going to break the handle, she said, coming up behind him. Ephraim stopped, breathing heavily. He leaned on the axe, his chest rising and falling. When he looked at her, his eyes were clear, the hollow exhaustion replaced by a stubborn, frustrated fire. The wood is damp, he said defensively. The wood is pine, a child could split it. Nydia stepped forward and held out a hand. Give it here. He hesitated, a flash of aristocratic pride warring with his exhaustion. Slowly he handed over the axe. Nydia gripped the worn wooden handle. It felt warm from his hands. You're holding it too tight, she instructed, stepping up to the scarred stump. And you're swinging from your shoulders. You'll tear a muscle. She set a round of pine on the block. She adjusted her stance, feet shoulder-width apart, feeling the familiar, solid weight of the tool. With a fluid motion, she raised the axe and brought it down, letting gravity and the weight of the iron head do the work. The log split perfectly in two with a sharp, satisfying crack. She turned back to him, holding the axe out. Let the weight fall. Don't force it. Ephraim took the axe back. As their fingers brushed, she noticed his palms. They were decimated. Blisters had formed, popped, and bled into raw red circles. He hadn't said a word about it. Nydia's jaw clenched. Go wash your hands. You're bleeding on my handle. I can finish. He insisted, turning back to the block. I said wash them. She snapped, sharper than she intended. She hated the guilt that spiked in her stomach. There's salve in the pantry. Use it. Ephraim looked at her. Really looked at her. His gaze dropped from her face to her own hands, colors rough, permanently scarred from burns and cuts. He slowly lowered the axe. Thank you, Nydia. It was the first time he had used her name. It sounded strange in his polished accent. Too soft. Before Nydia could form a biting retort, the sound of heavy hooves and jingling harnesses drifted from the front of the inn. Nydia's head snapped toward the building. Her stomach dropped. She hurried past Ephraim, pushing through the kitchen and out into the tap room. Standing in the center of her floor was Talon Harwood. Talon was the local magistrate's son, a man who wore his petty authority like a suffocating perfume. He was draped in a velvet cloak that looked ridiculous in the rustic inn, and he smelled of cheap wine and stale cloves. 2 armed guards stood by the door. Nydia, my sweet, Talon purred, turning to face her. His eyes swept over her with a familiar, greasy entitlement. You've missed your quarterly tax payment. Again, it's due on the 15th, Talon. Nydia said, her voice tight, keeping her distance. It's the 12th. The books were adjusted. Talon smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of his lips. He took a step closer, his boots loud on the floorboards. I'm here to collect 10 silver. Nidia's voice cracked. It was 5 last quarter. I don't have 10 silver, then we will have to collateralize. Talon said softly, closing the distance between them. He reached out, his gloved fingers clamping down hard on Nadia's wrist. She flinched, trying to pull back, but his grip was like a vice. Perhaps the inn itself, or perhaps we can work out an alternative arrangement. Nadia's heart hammered against her ribs. She was calculating her odds of driving a kitchen knife into his thigh and surviving the guards when a voice cut through the room. Release her. The words were spoken softly. They weren't a shout. They didn't echo, but they carried an absolute, undeniable authority that froze the air in the room. Nadia turned her head. Afram was standing in the archway of the kitchen. He was still wearing his stained shirt. His hands were bleeding, but his posture had entirely changed. He was no longer the broken man who had stumbled into her inn. His shoulders were pulled back, his chin elevated. He looked at Talon Hardwood not with anger, but with the cold, bored disgust of a man stepping on a roach. Talon blinked, dropping Nadia's wrist as if it had burned him. He turned to Afram, puffing his chest out. Who in the hells are you? This is official municipal business. Afram walked forward. He moved with a slow, predatory grace. He didn't look at the guards. He stopped 2 feet from Talon. My name is of no consequence to a clerk. Afram said, his voice dropping to a silken, dangerous register. But if you do not leave this immediately, I will ensure that the governor of this province, who owes me a considerable favor, has you reassigned to a border outpost so desolate you will forget what a warm fire feels like. The tap room was dead silent. Talon opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Afram's eyes. Whatever he saw there, the utter lack of bluff, the absolute certainty of power, made the color drain from the magistrate's face. He took a step back. The 15th. Talon stammered, wrapping his cloak tighter around himself. I will return on the 15th. He signaled his guards and hurried out the door, pulling it shut with a rattle of glass. Silence descended again, heavy and thick. Afram let out a slow breath, his rigid posture deflating slightly. He turned to Nidia, offering a small, reassuring nod. Are you unharmed? Nidia stared at him. She rubbed her wrist where Talon had grabbed her. Then a hot white fury bubbled up in her chest. She marched up to Afram, grabbed the front of his stained linen shirt, and shoved him backward. He stumbled, caught off guard, hitting the edge of a table. What is wrong with you? She hissed, her voice vibrating with rage. Afram looked bewildered. I was assisting you. He was going to. You just painted a target on my back. Nidia shouted, not caring who heard. He thinks you're a threat, which means he's going to find out who you are. And when he realizes you're hiding from someone much bigger than him, Njit, clears throat, Njit, he's going to sell you out, and they will burn my inn to the ground to get to you. I handled him. Afram argued, his own temper flaring, a flush rising in his cheeks. You handled him like a lord. Nidia snapped, pointing a shaking finger at his chest. You don't just threaten a magistrate and expect him to bow. You offended his pride. In my world, pride gets people killed. You didn't save me, Afram. You just guaranteed he comes back with a torch. Afram stared at her, his jaw locked. He looked down at her finger, then up at her furious, exhausted face. The silence stretched between them, raw and vibrating with 100 unsaid accusations. He didn't know her world. She didn't know his. Afram started, his voice suddenly small, the aristocratic armor cracking. I did not think no, Nidia said bitterly, turning away from him. Your kind rarely do. Wash your hands. You're bleeding on my floor. Morning arrived with the scent of damp wool and old grease, thick and suffocating. Nidia slammed the heavy iron skillet onto the stovetop, the loud crack echoing in the empty kitchen. She was still furious. Her anger burned low and steady in her gut, a familiar companion that kept her moving when her joints threatened to lock up. She expected Afram to be gone. After yesterday's outburst, a man of his standing should have packed his ruined calfskin boots and fled, his fragile pride shattered by a tavern keeper's screaming match. Instead, a rhythmic metallic scraping drifted from the taproom. Nydia wiped her hands on a coarse towel and marched through the archway, fully prepared to throw him out. She stopped short. Afram was on his knees. He had dragged the heavy iron grate away from the hearth and was using a stiff wire brush to scrub the century-old accumulation of soot and hardened ash from the stone hearthstone. He had abandoned his wool coat, entirely clad only in his linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. His forearms were corded with lean muscle, slick with sweat and blackened with soot. He coughed a harsh, dry sound as a cloud of ash puffed up into his face. He wiped his forehead with the back of a filthy wrist, smearing a thick streak of black grease across his brow. Nydia crossed her arms. "You're going to ruin that shirt." Afram paused, the wire brush hovering over the stone. He didn't look back at her immediately. He took a slow breath, staring down at the blackened bristles. "It's already ruined, Nydia. I suspect a little ash won't lower its value any further." He resumed scrubbing. The scraping sound was abrasive, grating against Nydia's frayed nerves. "I didn't ask you to do that," she said, her voice tight. "I know." Afram leaned into the brush, his shoulders bunching. "But you were right. Yesterday, I acted with the authority of a world that no longer exists for me, and I placed you in danger because of my own arrogance. I cannot undo the threat to your inn, but I can clean your hearth." It was an apology. A raw, unvarnished admission of guilt from a man who likely hadn't apologized to a living soul in a decade. It disarmed her. Nydia hated being disarmed. She walked over to the hearth, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the floorboards. She looked down at his hands. The blisters from yesterday's wood chopping had burst, the skin torn and weeping clear fluid, now mixed with toxic black soot. "Stop," she commanded. Afram kept scrubbing. "I am nearly finished with this section." "I said stop, Ephraim." She stepped closer, her boot nudging his knee. "If that ash gets into those open sores, your hands will rot off. I don't have the coin to hire a physician to amputate your fingers." He finally dropped the brush. It clattered against the stone. He sat back on his heels, his chest heaving slightly. The hollow exhaustion was back in his eyes, but there was something else there now, a desperate clawing need to be useful, to prove he wasn't just a liability. Go to the pump out back. Nydia sighed, dragging a hand down her face. She felt 10 years older than she was. "Scrub the soot off with the lye soap. It will sting like hell. Do not come back inside until the water runs clear." Afram looked at his hands, turning them over. They were a ruined mess of blood, ash, and torn skin. He gave a single jerky nod. He pushed himself up from the floor, his knees popping audibly in the quiet room, and walked out the back door without a word. Nydia watched him go, feeling a strange, heavy knot in her throat. She looked down at the hearthstone. He had actually managed to clean a massive square of it, revealing the pale grey granite beneath a generation of grime. She walked into the pantry and began pulling glass jars from the high shelf. She found the tin of drawing salve, a foul-smelling concoction of pine pitch, sulphur, and rendered mutton fat. It looked like mud and smelled like a shallow grave, but it pulled infection out of a wound faster than any apothecary's powder. When Afram returned, he was shivering. The water from the pump had soaked the front of his shirt, and the morning air was biting. His hands were raw, weeping and violently red, but the black suit was gone. "Sit," Nydia said, pointing to a stool by the kitchen work table. She didn't wait for him to settle before she grabbed his left hand. Her grip was firm, entirely lacking in bedside manner. Afram flinched a sharp intake of breath, hissing through his teeth, but he didn't pull away. Nydia scooped a generous dollop of the foul-smelling salve onto her fingers and smeared it unceremoniously across his torn palms. Afram's jaw locked so hard the muscle ticked visibly. "Gods above, what is that?" "Pine, pitch and fat," Nydia muttered, working the thick paste into the edges of the open blisters. "It burns because it's killing the rot. If you want a lavender compress, go back to your estate." "My estate?" Afram rasped, his voice strained from the pain. "Is currently occupied by a cousin who would prefer my head on a spike. I think I will tolerate the pine pitch." Nydia paused, her thumbs hovering over his palm. It was the first real piece of information he had offered about his past. She looked up. Afram was staring straight ahead, his eyes fixed on the cracked plaster of the kitchen wall, his expression carved from stone. She didn't ask. Asking meant involvement. Instead, she tore a strip of clean linen from a roll on the table and began wrapping his hand with quick, practiced, tight movements. "Tomorrow," Nydia said quietly, tying the bandage off with a sharp tug, "you peel the potatoes. You can do that with your thumbs." Afram looked down at his bandaged hand, then up at her. The ghost of that small, broken smile touched his lips again. "Potatoes. Yes, I believe I can manage that." Friday nights at Stuart's Rest were a chaotic mess of spilled cider and loud arguments. The local copper miners, their faces permanently stained with grey dust, flooded the taproom the moment the sun dipped below the tree line. They brought with them the overwhelming stench of stale sweat, damp wool, and the sour tang of cheap ale. Nydia was moving violently behind the bar, her arms a blur as she filled heavy wooden tankards from the brass taps. The noise in the room was a physical weight, a deafening roar of laughter, crashing wood, and off-key singing that rattled the pewter plates on the walls. She was drowning. She was 3 orders behind, the stew pot was boiling over in the kitchen, and a fight was brewing in the corner booth between 2 men arguing over a card game. Nydia. 2. More of the dark. A miner roared, slamming his empty mug onto the scarred wood of the bar. "Give me a minute, Elias, or jump the bar and pour it yourself." She snapped back, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She grabbed 2 mugs, shoving them beneath the tap when a shadow fell over her. Afram stood beside her. He was wearing an oversized stained canvas apron over his shirt. His hands were still bandaged, though the linen was now grey and frayed. "What do you need?" he asked. His voice barely carried over the din of the tavern, but it cut through Nydia's panic with startling clarity. "I need 3 bowls of venison stew to table 4, and someone to drag Elias out the door before he breaks my good chairs." She barked, not looking at him, swapping the full mugs for empty ones. "But you are not a bouncer. Go back to your room. 3 stews, table 4. Afram repeated. Nydia spun around, ready to yell at him to stay out of the way, but he was already gone. Through the haze of pipe smoke and bodies, she watched him. The Duke of whatever estate was stolen from him was carrying a heavy wooden tray loaded with 3 steaming bowls of stew. He didn't walk with the arrogant, space-claiming stride he had arrived with. He navigated the crowded floorboards by slipping his shoulders sideways, ducking past swinging elbows, anticipating the drunken swaying of the miners. A burly man backed up, suddenly slamming hard into Afram's shoulder. Nydia stopped pouring. Her breath caught. This was it. The moment his aristocratic pride snapped, the moment he demanded an apology, or threw the hot stew in the man's face. Afram stumbled, the bowls rattling dangerously on the tray. Some of the hot broth sloshed over the side, landing squarely on his bandaged thumb. He didn't flinch. He simply shifted his weight, stabilized the tray, and politely stepped around the oblivious miner without a single word. He delivered the food to table 4, collected 2 empty sticky tankards, and carried them back to the bar. He set them down gently. "Next?" Afram asked, his chest heaving slightly in the sweltering heat of the room. Nydia stared at him. His jaw was tight with effort, and his hair was plastered to his forehead with sweat. He looked utterly out of place, a thoroughbred horse strapped to a plough, but he was pulling. He was actually pulling. "Table 2 needs another pitcher," she said, her voice softer than she intended. She handed him a heavy ceramic jug. For the next 4 hours, they worked in a brutal, unspoken rhythm. Afram bussed tables, wiped up spilled vomit with a rag, and carried endless trays of sloshing ale. He was shoved, he was sworn at, and a drunk woman pinched his backside hard enough to make him jump, but he never broke. He swallowed his pride so completely it must have cut his throat on the way down. By 2:00 in the morning, the taproom was finally empty. The silence rang in Nydia's ears, thick and heavy. The air was sour and hot, thick with the ghosts of 100 conversations. Nydia sat heavily in a chair by the dying hearth fire. Her feet throbbed in rhythm with her heartbeat. She let her head fall back against the wood, closing her eyes. The scrape of a chair being pulled out made her open them. Ephraim sank into the seat across from her. He looked entirely hollowed out. His apron was stained with old gravy and mud. He unclasped his hands, resting them on his knees. The bandages were soaked through black with grime and dark red with fresh blood. He stared into the dying embers, his face illuminated by the dull orange glow. Nydia sighed a bone-deep exhalation. She pushed herself up from the chair, her knees screaming in protest, and walked to the bar. She grabbed a clean rag, a bowl of warm water from the stove, and the tin of foul-smelling salve. She walked back and pulled up a stool directly in front of him. "Give them here," she said quietly. Ephraim looked at her. The defenses were completely gone from his eyes, leaving only a raw, bruised exhaustion. He slowly extended his hands. Nydia began to unwind the ruined bandages. The cloth stuck to the dried blood, and she had to soak it with the warm water to peel it away without tearing the skin further. The blisters on his palms had broken open again, the flesh raw and angry. She worked in silence, cleaning the grime away with a gentle precision she rarely used. The tavern was quiet save for the occasional pop of a log in the hearth and the distant lonely howl of the wind outside. "You shouldn't have carried the hot bowls," Nydia murmured, her head bent over his hands, focusing on wiping away a smear of grease from his knuckle. "The heat aggravates the burns." "You were drowning," Ephraim said simply. Nydia paused. She looked up at him through her lashes. He was watching her hands, his expression unreadable. "I've drowned before," Nydia said, her voice tight, defensive. "I know how to tread water. You shouldn't have to." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and dangerous. Nydia felt a sudden terrifying flutter in her chest. She violently pushed it down, burying it under a decade of hard-earned cynicism. She dug 2 fingers into the tin of salve and smeared a thick layer across his raw palm. Ephraim hissed, his fingers curling instinctively, but she held his hand flat, her thumb pressing firmly against the back of his knuckles. "Don't flatter yourself, Ephraim," Nydia said, her voice returning to its familiar gravelly rasp as she began wrapping fresh linen around his palm. "You're just free labor. If you slow me down, I'm throwing you to the magistrate." Ephraim didn't argue. He watched her tar off the bandage, his gaze dropping to the harsh, burn-scarred skin of her own wrists. "Understood," he said softly, but he didn't pull his hand away when she finished. And for a long fractured moment in the dim light of the dying fire, Nydia didn't let go, either. Heavy boots on the porch signaled the end of their brief truce with reality. Tuesday afternoon had brought a biting crosswind that rattled the tavern's warped window panes. But the sound of the front door being kicked open cut through the draft entirely. Ozone and unwashed bodies. That was the immediate scent that rolled into the taproom, overpowering the familiar aroma of Nydia's baking bread. Nydia froze, a damp rag half clenched in her raw hands. 3 men stood in her doorway. They were not miners seeking a midday pint. They wore mismatched boiled leather, their knuckles heavily collared, their faces carrying the flat, deadened expressions of men who hurt people for a daily wage. Behind them, stepping carefully over the threshold so as not to scuff his polished riding boots, was Talon Harwood. "I told you, Nydia," Talon said. His voice was a reedy nasal whine that grated against the silence of the empty room. "The 15th. We are here for the municipal tax. 10 silver pieces." Nydia's stomach plummeted, a cold heavy stone dropping into her pelvis. She wiped her hands on her apron, her mind frantically cataloguing the makeshift weapons behind the bar. A heavy wooden mallet for tapping kegs, a cast-iron skillet, a rusted paring knife. "I don't have 10 silver. I told you that," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady, betraying none of the frantic calculation happening behind her eyes. "Then we collateralize." Talon smiled, a thin, satisfied stretching of his lips. He gestured lazily to the largest of the 3 men, a towering brute with a missing front tooth, and a nose that had been broken and reset off center. "Giles." Take the good oak chairs, smash the rest so she understands the gravity of delinquency. Giles grunted, stepping forward. He reached for a heavy, high-backed chair near the window, one of the few pieces Nadia's father had carved by hand before the sickness took him. "Don't touch that." Nadia snapped her hand, dropping below the bar to wrap around the handle of the wooden mallet. Giles ignored her. His thick fingers closed around the polished oak spine of the chair. Before he could lift it, a sound sliced through the room. It was the sharp metallic shink of a blade being drawn from a scabbard. Talon jumped, letting out a wholly undignified squeak. Afram stepped out of the kitchen archway. He held no sword. In his right hand, gripped with a terrifying loose familiarity, was the long wicked iron poker from the hearth. The tip still glowed a dull, angry orange from the coals. He didn't wear his ruined coat. His linen shirt was stained with soot and grease. His sleeves rolled up, his bandaged hands gripping the iron tight. He didn't look like a tavern boy. He looked like a soldier who had found himself on the wrong end of a siege and decided he didn't care if he survived it so long as he took someone with him. "Leave the chair," Afram said. His voice didn't rise. It was a flat, dead calm that sent a shiver down Nadia's spine. Talon retreated behind his men, pointing a trembling gloved finger at Afram. You're the vagrant who threatened me." "Giles, break his legs. Then take the chairs." Giles dropped the chair. It hit the floorboards with a heavy thud. He drew a short, heavy cudgel from his belt and charged. Afram didn't brace for impact. He stepped off the center line, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace that belonged on a dueling piece, not a sticky tavern floor. As Giles barreled past, driven by his own momentum, Afram swung the heavy iron poker. He didn't aim for the head. He brought the shaft down hard, a vicious targeted strike against the back of Giles' knee. Bone crunched. Giles roared a wet, guttural sound of agony and collapsed sideways, crashing through a small side table and splintering the pine into a dozen jagged pieces. The other two men didn't hesitate. They rushed Afram simultaneously. What followed was not a heroic choreographed dance. It was brutal, sloppy, and desperate. Afram caught the first man across the jaw with the heavy iron handle of the poker, snapping the man's head back with a sickening crack. But the second man tackled him around the waist. They hit the floor hard. The poker clattered away, sliding under the bar. Afram grunted, all the air leaving his lungs in a violent rush. The mercenary was heavy, smelling of stale onions and sweat, throwing short, vicious punches into Afram's ribs. Afram's hands were bandaged and raw, but he drove an elbow up, catching the man in the throat. Nadia didn't scream. She didn't cower. She vaulted the low side of the bar, her boots hitting the floorboards with a heavy thud, the wooden tapping mallet clenched in her fist. The first man, recovering from the blow to his jaw, drew a long hunting knife and lunged toward Afram's exposed back. Nadia swung. She put her shoulders, her hips, and 5 years of bitter, suffocating resentment into the motion. The wooden mallet connected squarely with the side of the mercenary's head. The impact vibrated up her arm, jarring her elbow. The man's eyes rolled back, and he crumpled like a sack of wet grain. Afram shoved the gasping man off his chest, scrambling to his knees. He grabbed the mercenary by the collar of his boiled leather vest and drove a bare, bandaged fist into his nose. Blood sprayed hot and bright across the floorboards. The man went entirely limp. Silence slammed back into the room, deafening in its suddenness. Afram remained on his knees, his chest heaving, pulling air into his lungs in ragged, tearing gasps. He pressed a hand to his ribs, wincing sharply. Nadia stood over the unconscious man, her chest rising and falling, the heavy wooden mallet dangling from her trembling fingers. She looked at the wreckage. Smashed pine, splintered wood, a puddle of dark blood staining the floorboards she had scrubbed on her hands and knees just yesterday. She turned her head slowly. Talon Harwood was standing in the open doorway. His face was the color of spoiled milk. He looked at the 3 broken men on the floor, then at Afram, who was slowly pushing himself to his feet. His eyes locked on the magistrate with a promise of absolute violence. Talon turned and ran. He didn't say a word. He just fled, his boots slipping in the mud outside. Nydia dropped the mullet. It hit the floor with a hollow, useless sound. She looked at her shattered tables. She looked at the blood. Her livelihood, already hanging by a frayed thread, had just been snapped entirely. Shattered glass crunched underfoot loud as pistol shots in the dead quiet of the tap room. It was 2 hours past sundown. They had dragged the groaning men out to the muddy road, leaving them for the night watch to find. Nydia swept the broken pine into a pile near the hearth. Her movements were robotic, jerky, fueled by a potent cocktail of adrenaline and despair. She hadn't spoken since Talon ran. There was nothing to say. Words wouldn't rebuild the tables. Words wouldn't pay the ironmonger for new hinges. Afram sat on the one remaining stool by the bar. He was holding a scrap of clean linen to a deep, jagged cut above his left eyebrow. The blood had dried into a dark crust down the side of his face. His breathing was shallow, catching slightly every time he shifted his weight. Bruised ribs, maybe broken. He watched her sweep. He watched the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she aggressively pushed the broom against the floorboards, as if she could erase the memory of the fight with enough friction. "I have enough copper saved to replace the glass," Nydia finally said, breaking the silence. Her voice was raspy, devoid of inflection. She stared at the pile of splinters. "The tables. I can nail the planks back together. They'll be uneven, but miners don't care about uneven tables when they're drunk." Afram lowered the linen from his brow. "Nydia." "Don't," she snapped, pointing the handle of the broom at him. She didn't look at his face. She couldn't. If she looked at his bruised, battered face, she would scream. "Don't apologize. Don't offer me useless aristocratic platitudes. I just need to figure out how to stretch the flour for another week." Afram stood up. He moved slowly, his left arm wrapped protectively around his torso. He didn't walk toward her. He walked toward the stairs. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice hitching slightly despite her best efforts to keep it flat. "To pack my bag." Afram replied, his back to her, his hand resting on the wooden banister. "Talon will return. Not tomorrow, perhaps, but soon. He will return with the town guard. If I am here, they will burn this into the ground to drag me out of it." Nydia tightened her grip on the broom handle until her knuckles turned stark white. "So, you're running," she said, coating the words in a thick layer of venom. It was easier to be angry. Anger was a familiar warm coat. Fear was a freezing rain, of course. The moment the game gets too rough, the Lord abandons the peasantry. Should have expected it. Afram stopped on the first step. He turned around, leaning heavily against the banister. The exhaustion in his eyes was absolute. It was a bone-deep weariness that stripped away every layer of polished defense he possessed. "I am leaving," he said softly, "because my presence here is a hazard to you. You are drowning, Nydia. And I am an anchor chained to your ankle. I decide what drags me down," Nydia yelled, slamming the broom against the floor. The loud crack echoed in the empty room. She stalked toward him, her chest heaving the bitter, cynical wall she had built around herself cracking wide open. "I took you in. I bandaged your hands. I let you ruin my best skillet. You don't get to just walk out when the bill comes due and pretend you're doing me a favor. Look around you," Ephraim shouted back, his voice finally breaking raw and ragged. He gestured sharply at the wreckage, wincing as the movement pulled his bruised ribs. "I brought violence into your home. I shattered your tables. I painted a target on your back for a petty magistrate because I could not control my own damned pride." He took a step down, closing the distance between them, his towering frame casting a long shadow over her in the dim light. "I have no coin to fix this. I have no name to protect you with. The only thing of value I can offer you right now is my absence." Nydia stared up at him. She saw the tremor in his jaw. She saw the dark, ugly bruising blooming across his ribs through the torn linen of his shirt. He wasn't running from the fight. He was trying to shield her from the fallout. It infuriated her. It terrified her. "Your absence doesn't rebuild my tables, Ephraim," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh, strained whisper. "Then what do you want from me?" he asked, a desperate hollow crack in his voice. He looked entirely lost, a man who had commanded armies and governed estates reduced to begging a tavern keeper for an answer he didn't have. Nydia looked at the cut above his eye, still slowly seeping dark red. She looked at his ruined, bandaged hands that he had destroyed trying to clean her hearth. She reached out. It wasn't a gentle motion. She grabbed the front of his torn shirt, her rough, calloused fingers curling into the fabric. She pulled him forward, forcing him to lean down slightly to meet her gaze. "You owe me a table," she said fiercely, her eyes burning into his. "You owe me 3 unchipped mugs. You owe me an iron hinge for the front door. You don't get to leave until you've worked off every single copper of that debt. Do you understand me?" Afram stared at her, his breath catching in his throat. He was close enough that she could smell the copper tang of blood and the faint lingering scent of expensive lavender beneath the sweat and soot. He didn't pull away from her grip. His eyes, dark and turbulent, searched her face looking for the lie. He found none. He found only the fierce, terrifying, imperfect stubbornness that kept Stuart's Rest standing. Slowly, the tension drained from his shoulders. He let out a long, shuddering breath, his forehead resting briefly against hers. It was a momentary collapse of boundaries, a microscopic surrender in the middle of a war zone. "I understand," Afram whispered, his voice rough. Nydia released his shirt and stepped back, instantly reinforcing the invisible wall between them. She cleared her throat, aggressively smoothing her apron. "Good," she muttered, turning back toward the kitchen, refusing to acknowledge the sudden frantic hammering of her own heart. "There's leftover stew on the stove. Eat it. Then go fix the door hinge. The draft is freezing my ankles." Winter tightened its grip on the valley, freezing the rutted mud outside Stuart's Rest into treacherous, jagged ridges. Inside the tavern smelled of fresh pine shavings and simmering mutton. Afram did not leave. He rebuilt the shattered tables. It was a slow, agonizing process. He possessed no carpentry skills, only a stubborn, punishing will to fulfill the debt Nydia had screamed at him. He spent 3 days in the drafty barn out back, wrestling with a rusted handsaw and a warped plane. When he finally hauled the first replacement table into the taproom, it was undeniably lopsided. The joints were thick with excess wood glue, and the surface bore the erratic gauges of a man learning how to use a chisel through trial and error. Nydia walked around it, wiping a rag over the uneven pine. She ran her thumb over a particularly deep gouge near the corner. "It wobbles," she noted, her voice flat. "A folded coaster under the left leg rectifies the imbalance." Afram replied instantly, standing a few feet away. He was leaning heavily on his left leg, his ribs still tightly bound beneath his shirt. His hands were out of the bandages, but they were permanently altered. The soft, pale skin of an aristocrat was gone, replaced by thick, yellowish calluses and a network of raised pink scars across his knuckles. Nydia looked down at the coaster he had preemptly wedged beneath the uneven leg. She fought a sudden, irritating urge to smile. She killed the expression before it could reach her eyes. Miners lean heavy when they drink. If it collapses and spills Alyosha's ale, you're mopping it up. Understood. They settled into a strange, bruising rhythm. Afram became a fixture at Stuart's Rest, a silent shadow that anticipated the tavern's breaking points. He learned to tap the heavy ale kegs without foaming the brew. He learned that the cellar flooded when the snow melted, preemptively moving the sacks of flour to higher shelves. He stopped speaking in the polished, commanding cadence of a lord and adopted the clipped economic syllables of a man who worked with his hands. Nydia watched him. She hated herself for it, but she watched him. She noticed the way his broad shoulders filled out the cheap rough-spun canvas shirts she bought him from the market. She noticed the dark shadow of stubble that now perpetually coated his jaw, hiding the aristocratic sharp lines of his face. She noticed that he never complained about the bitter cold in his room, though she often heard him pacing the floorboards late at night to keep warm. The distance between them remained carefully policed. Nydia barked orders. Afram obeyed. But the silence beneath their sparse words grew heavy, thick with a dangerous unspoken dependency. She no longer calculated how much flour she needed for a week of survival. She calculated for 2. The illusion of safety shattered on a Tuesday. A traveling merchant smelling of wet wool and cheap pipe weed slammed a hammered copper mug onto the bar. Kingsguard on the southern road, he mumbled to Nydia, wiping ale foam from his mustache. 50 men, heavy armor, stopping every wagon, searching for a runaway. Nydia's hand stilled on the wooden tap handle. A runaway? Treason, they say. The merchant leaned in, lowering his voice. A high lord who refused to burn a rebel village. King wants his head on a spike outside the capital. Nydia poured the ale, her hands remarkably steady. She pushed the mug across the wood. More trouble for the rest of us. She waited until the merchant took his drink to the hearth. Then she moved quickly. She walked through the archway into the kitchen, pushing open the heavy back door. Ephraim was by the woodpile, splitting oak logs for the evening fire. He swung the axe with brutal mechanical efficiency, the blade biting cleanly through the dense wood. He had learned the leverage. She said sharply. He stopped lowering the axe, his chest rising and falling. He looked at her instantly, reading the tight white lines around her mouth. "They're on the southern road," she said, wrapping her arms around her ribs against the biting wind. 50 Kingsguard looking for a traitor. Ephraim stood perfectly still. The cold wind ruffled his dark hair, plastering it against his forehead. He didn't look surprised. He looked resigned. It was the same hollow, deadened expression he had worn the night he stumbled into her inn. He carefully embedded the axe into the chopping block. "I will pack my things," he said quietly, his voice carrying no emotion. "To go where?" Nydia demanded, stepping off the porch, her boots crunching on the frozen grass. "The roads are blocked. It's a 3-day trek through the woods to the next border, and you'll freeze to death before you make it 10 miles without a proper coat. It is better I freeze in the woods than they find me in your cellar, Nydia." He walked past her, smelling of fresh pine and sweat. Nydia grabbed his arm. Her fingers dug into the rough canvas of his sleeve. He stopped, but he didn't look at her. His jaw was locked, a muscle ticking wildly beneath the stubble. "I didn't spend the last 2 months feeding you my good stew and teaching you how to swing a hammer just for you to die in a snowbank," she hissed, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Ephraim finally turned his head. His dark eyes were burning, completely stripped of his usual controlled calm. "They will hang you for harboring me. They will not ask questions. They will not care that you did not know my full name. They will burn this inn and string you up from the signpost. I will not allow that. You don't get to allow or disallow anything in my house." Nydia shouted, the raw panic leaking into her voice. "I survived the plague that took my father. I survived the tax collectors. I survived this town every single day. Do not treat me like a fragile porcelain doll that needs a lord's protection." They were inches apart, the freezing air turning their panicked breaths into white plumes that mingled between them. Ephraim reached up. He didn't push her hand away. Instead, his scarred, calloused fingers wrapped gently over hers where she gripped his sleeve. His thumb brushed across her knuckles. "Nydia," he whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of him, leaving a raw, terrifying vulnerability. "I am a dead man. I have been a dead man since the night I walked through your door. Please, let me leave before I pull you into the grave with me." "No," she said, her voice cracking. She stepped closer, invading his space. Her chin tilted up fiercely. "You owe me a door hinge, Ephraim, and you haven't fixed it yet." Metal hit wood with a resounding crash. Talon Hardwood kicked the front door of Stuart's Rest open, stepping into the taproom with a smug, triumphant sneer. Behind him walked 2 men who made Giles and his mercenaries look like schoolyard bullies. They wore the heavy polished plate armor of the Kingsguard, blue cloaks pinned at their shoulders with silver medallions. The taproom was empty of patrons. Nydia stood behind the bar, methodically wiping down a pristine mug with a rag. She didn't flinch at the noise. "Good afternoon, Talon," she said, her voice dripping with bored irritation. "Still haven't learned how to use a doorknob." Talon sneered, stepping aside to let the captain of the guard approach the bar. The captain was an older man, his face scarred, his eyes carrying the weary, ruthless calculation of a veteran soldier. "We are conducting a search of the premises," the captain said, his heavy gauntlets resting on the bar. "By order of the Crown, we are looking for a man of tall stature, dark hair bearing the aristocratic features of the southern houses." Nydia let out a dry, harsh laugh. She tossed the rag onto the counter. "Aristocrats? Here, Captain, my cheapest ale tastes like copper runoff, and my mattresses are stuffed with hay. The only lords that come through here are the ones who got lost on their way to the brothel in the next county." He was spotted in this sector. The captain pressed, his eyes narrowing. "A dangerous fugitive, and the magistrate here claims you've been harboring a stranger." Nydia shot Talon a look of pure, unadulterated venom. "Talon claims a lot of things, mostly that I owe him money I don't have. I took on a new cellar rat to haul firewood. That's it. Produce him." The captain ordered, "Help yourself." Nydia gestured lazily toward the back window. "He's out back fixing the pigsty." The captain nodded to his subordinate. The younger guard walked heavily across the floorboards, pulling back the thick woolen curtain that covered the kitchen window. Outside in the freezing mud, a man was waist-deep in a collapsed wooden pen. He wore a filthy, torn canvas tunic, his face smeared with brown muck and soot. He was violently wrestling a massive, squealing sow away from a broken fence post, shouting curses in coarse, gutter-snipe slang. His hands were brutalized, thick with calluses, gripping a heavy wooden mallet. The guard watched for a moment, his nose wrinkling in disgust at the sight and the implied smell. He let the curtain drop and turned back to his captain. "Just a common laborer, sir," the guard reported, "up to his knees in shit." The captain studied Nydia's face for a long silent moment. Nydia stared back, her expression perfectly masked in cynical blue-collar irritation. She looked bored. She looked exactly like a woman whose biggest problem was a broken pigpen. "Search the rooms," the captain commanded. They tore the inn apart. They overturned mattresses, kicked open wardrobes, and smashed several ceramic jugs in the cellar. Through it all, Nydia stood behind the bar tallying the cost of the damages in her head, projecting an aura of furious impatience. 30 minutes later, the guards returned empty-handed. "If you see a man matching the description, you will report it," the captain said, throwing a silver coin onto the bar to cover the broken pottery. "If he pays in silver, I'll rent him a room. If he doesn't, I'll point him down the road." Nydia replied, coolly pocketing the coin. Talon looked furious, his face blotchy with red rage. He opened his mouth to argue, but the captain shoved him toward the door. "Move, Harwood. We have 3 more miles to cover before nightfall." The door slammed shut. Nydia didn't move for 10 full minutes. She waited until the heavy thud of the horse's hooves faded entirely into the wind, then her knees buckled. She caught herself on the edge of the bar, her breath leaving her lungs in a shaky, violent gasp. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, her whole body trembling with the delayed shock of adrenaline. The back door hinges creaked softly. Ephron walked into the kitchen. He was covered in mud and manure, smelling atrociously. He carried the heavy wooden mallet in his scarred hand. He walked through the archway and stopped behind the bar. He looked at the wreckage the guards had left. Then he looked at Nydia. She lowered her hands. Her eyes were red, her chest heaving. She stared at him, taking in the mud, the ruined tunic, the absolute degradation he had willingly subjected himself to just to sell a lie to a soldier. He didn't look like a duke. He looked like Ephron. "The so bit me," he said, his voice deadly serious. A laugh caught in Nydia's throat. It was a jagged, ugly sound that tore out of her half-sob and half-relief. She covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking, leaning back against the wooden shelves. Ephron closed the distance between them. He dropped the mallet. It clattered against the floorboards. He didn't care about the mud, and he didn't care about the filth. He reached out his rough, scarred hands framing her face, his thumbs gently wiping away a stray tear that had escaped her hardened facade. "You stayed," She whispered, her voice fractured. I am never leaving Nydia, he murmured, his forehead resting heavily against hers. The smell of mud and cold wind surrounded them. But beneath it all was the steady, solid heat of his presence. You owe me a silver coin, and I intend to collect on the interest. Nydia closed her eyes, leaning into the closed heat of his palms. The inn was shattered, the town was hostile, and winter was entirely unforgiving. But as she stood in the wreckage, grounded by the steady beating of his heart, Nydia realized she wasn't drowning anymore. Thank you so much for watching this complete historical drama. If Nydia and Afram's intense, slow-burn romance kept you hooked until the very end, please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deeply emotional stories. What was your favorite moment between them? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video with your fellow romance lovers and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. See you in the next story.